Well, good morning, everybody. I'd like to thank the Waterveiligheidscongres for the invite to have a discussion with you this morning. It's a pleasure for me to be here. It's not very far from where I live. I live in Sommelsdijk at Goeree Overflakkee, so it's quite close. It's a pleasure for me to talk with you this morning about my experience during the flood in Serbia in 2014. Before I'm going to talk about this topic, I will introduce briefly myself and also the firm, Waterveiligheidscongres DHV, a globally acting engineering firm, to you. And well, my idea of this presentation is, of course, hopefully you will learn something about it, about emergency response and how that works in these days. But it hopefully also inspires you for your education to become a water professional. Just a little bit about our firm. Waterveiligheidscongres DHV is an engineering firm, an architect firm. We are active in all kinds of markets, airport design, ports, port design, but also an important element of our activities is the work that we do in the field of flood control or flood protection and water management. We have globally 7,000 staff. And mainly the offices are in Asia, in Africa, and of course in the Netherlands, the United Kingdom, and also Poland. I'm part of the business line Rivers, Deltas and Coast, so that's the business line that focuses on the aspects like water management and flood control. Just a little bit about myself. I have a civil engineering background, so I did a study in Delft University and graduated in 1998. And after that also completed a PhD. Then I moved to Waterveiligheidscongres, worked on several big projects in the Netherlands, like the river widening at Nijmegen, the early stages of that project. The good news is currently it's under construction, it's almost finished. So, but that was in 2003-04. I started working on the environmental impact assessment of this project. After Hurricane Katrina, I moved to New Orleans in the United States to assist the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers with the upgrading the new levee system around the city. It was a very rewarding project. It was a huge investment of the U.S. government after this disaster to give this city a better level of protection. So it was a $14 billion project completed in 6 years. So we are in the Netherlands. We are very proud of our Room for the River program, which is of course a very nice program, but it is a €2 billion project, I think. Give or take, completed in about 20 years. In the United States, they completed this $14 billion program in 6 years. Of course, it was a different type of project, so maybe that also explains why it could be much more quicker than it's going on in the Netherlands. But anyway, that was a big project that I've been working on, and right now I'm responsible for the portfolio of projects, flood control projects that we do globally. So we are active in various countries. This is just to give you a glimpse of the projects that we do. I told already a bit about the New Orleans project after Hurricane Katrina, but we're also active in various continents. Currently we do, for instance, a big project in Bangladesh on upgrading the protection around several polders in the coastal zone of Bangladesh. Important A project has also been right now an early warning system, building an early warning system for Ghana in West Africa. That's a project that is financed by the United Nations Development Program. And that's a project to help people to get them early warned if there is a flood coming. So a lot of projects around the world, often with Dutch involvement, but also, of course, with local resources. So if your ambition is to have an international career in water management or flood control, then I think our firm is a good place to be. Now a bit about the Serbia flooding. The Serbia flooding, and I will talk a bit more about the background why this happened in a few slides. But I got a call. I was on a soccer pitch, actually quite close here in Bruinisse, with my son on a Saturday, and I got a call from Geneva in Switzerland whether I could become part of an UNDEC team. And UNDEC is an acronym that is stands for United Nations Disaster Assessment and Coordination. So that's UNDAC. That team was being mobilized on May the 16th, and it was requested by the resident coordinator. And I will talk about those details a little bit later on. We quickly mobilized the team, so I was called upon here, and within a day I was in an airplane to go to Serbia to assist the Serbian government. And it was a team of about 5 or later on 6 people with different expertise. So it was expertise of flooding, but also environmental assessment. There was a logistics guy involved in it. And there was, of course, also a team leader. As I said, the UNDEC is a system that is in place within the United Nations. And the United Nations is, of course, a very big organization, but UNDEC is one element of it. And this system works as follows. Of course, always a national government is always in charge of emergency response. And the UNDEC system is in place to assist national governments during very large disasters like earthquakes, like floodings, or like other kinds of big disasters. Well, why did the United Nations decide to put this system in place? Well, it was the experience after a big earthquake, I think it was the early 1990s, that the assistance from international donors like different countries resulted in a complete mess. It was an earthquake, and there were all kinds of people from abroad coming in to offer their help to this specific country. And all those people who came in by airplanes with rescue dogs, etc., they all ended up at the airport, and nobody was able to get them off the airport and let them do something for the country itself. So that let the United Nations decide, okay, there should be a system in place to help national governments to coordinate international assistance, and also to help national governments if there is a very big disaster going on. And that is why the UNDEC system is in place. And the UNDEC system is a system that a national government can request assistance from the United Nations. And then the United Nations calls upon, well, they have a big list of team leaders and also experts in different fields. And they can very quickly be mobilized to assist a national government. Well, in this case, the resident coordinator in Belgrade, she came with this request through the national authorities, and we were mobilized within a day to assist during this flooding. Our basis was in Belgrade, in the capital of Serbia, and we did all kinds of field trips to the affected areas. Of course, during these kind of missions, security is always a big issue. Security not only from, of course, from the flooding and those kind of things. So security is a big issue, and that was being taken care of by also by parts of the United Nations system. And after about 2 weeks, we ended up with finalizing our report, gave a briefing to the national government of Serbia, and demobilized. Well, this is just a first shot on what we saw when we arrived. This picture is a picture of a hotel in one of the cities that was affected very significantly, Obrenovac. It's only 20 kilometers outside of Belgrade. Well, we decided to set up our coordination center next to the coordination center of the Ministry of Interior, because that ministry in Serbia was responsible for the emergency operations. Next to our UN mission, and then you can see sometimes how complicated, let's say, this whole international collaboration works. Next to our mission from UNDEC, there was also an EU mission on the ground. Maybe you know that Serbia is one of those countries who likes to enter the EU. It's right now. It's a candidate for entering the European Union. So also the EU decided to send a team to Serbia during the flood. Well, very quickly we came in touch with this EU team and tried to come to some sort of common understanding on what would be the, let's say, our scope versus what would be the scope of the EU team to work on. Because what you definitely want to avoid in those situations is that everybody is doing his own thing, or that you basically do a double kind of certain activities. Well, it was decided that the UNDEC team, so our team, should concentrate on let's say, the needs assessment. So what is necessary for relief of people who are displaced, in terms of food or in terms of water or those kind of things, and what is also can we also come up with the first assessment of the damage. The damage to like roads, the damage to flood control infrastructure like dikes or pump stations, those kind of things, because that is important input for of course the discussions with the international community on how to help this country. Well, the good news of the UNDEC system is in a lot of countries there is always, let's say, already let's say a permanent establishment of the UN available, so UNDEC can always make very quick use of that system. And we, of course, partnered with all kinds of other organizations like the Red Cross and all kinds of organizations to work with them in this matter. This was the team. It was an international team composed of people. There was a person from Switzerland. There was our team leader was from Denmark. A very experienced person who has done this already for multiple times. So he really knew, let's say, how this system worked. For me, it was actually the first time to be part of this UNDEC mission. And that was a very good experience. This gentleman, also working for a consultancy firm in Denmark, was an environmental specialist. And this is also interesting. This person was from the United Kingdom, and he mapping of, let's say, the needs and making good maps in an early phase of a big disaster is always very important, and to get a very quick overview on what is needed and where are the actual issues. So maps are to make quickly good maps is an important part of this work. And well, he is part of the of a team who can help quickly with setting up these kind of things. Well, these were let's say the partners that we cooperated with very frequently during our mission. As I said, Map Action. That's a separate organization who assists in working with the UN on these maps. Of course, the office of the resident coordinator, so that's a local office from the United Nations, and of course the Ministry of Interior. Just to give you an idea of what happened during the flooding, this is a map that we quickly produced after our arrival to give an overview on where the flooding occurred in Serbia. It was not only a flooding that occurred in Serbia, because also Bosnia and other countries in the Balkan were affected, but our focus in this UNDEC mission was on Serbia. Well, this is a map of Serbia. This is the capital, Belgrade. This is the Danube, so that's the big river flowing roughly from, let's say, the Germany, Austria, and then into Serbia, and then it flows all the way to the Black Sea in Romania. And the big issues during this flood in May 2014 occurred in the Sava river basin. Sava is this river flowing through Bosnia, and then entering and Croatia, and then entering Serbia, and then flowing into the Danube here at Belgrade. And another area of concern was the Morava river basin, which is another tributary from the Danube in this area. So both this area in Serbia and the Morava river basin were affected. I now like to ask Christian to get the movie running, because what you will see is to get a feel, let's say, for the extent of the flooding. I was on a helicopter trip in one of the first days to get an overview of the flood extent in the river. And this movie will give you a bit of a flavor on to restart it again, I think. Yeah, so what you see here is we worked together with the team from Hungary. Hungary had sent during the flooding several helicopters to assist with for rescuing people, and we could be on one of those trips with them to just to get a feel for the extent of the flooding, and also look at specific spots where they had to see whether there was damage to flood control infrastructure. So what we did is we made a trip from an airport near Belgrade, and then flying upstream along the Sava river basin. The good news, of course, of these helicopter flights is, of course, that you are relatively low, so you can inspect, let's say, what's going on very carefully. Well, what you do see here is we made our way from Belgrade to the city of Obrenovac, which is I think around 30 kilometers outside of Belgrade. And what you do see already is that huge areas around the Sava River were flooded. Here you see this is part of the city of Obrenovac, with the hotel that you also saw on the earlier slides, and showing the extent. This is a town of, I think, around 50,000 people. It was completely flooded. In certain places it got 1, 2, 3 meters of water. The water level also rose very quickly, and there were about 50 to 60 people drowned in this city during this flood. And you see here the road. This road was still accessible from Belgrade, and you could stop at this hotel. And that hotel also acted as some sort of a shelter for people who did not have any home anymore. Another issue next to Obrenovac was there was a big, this is the so-called Tent A, which is a power plant. It is, let's say, providing 1/3, so 1/3 of the energy supply for whole Serbia is being produced at this power plant. And this power plant was flooded during this event. It was not, let's say, completely flooded, but the basement was flooded. But because they had their electricity and the generators, let's say, in the basement, the whole power plant was shut down, and they couldn't produce energy anymore for Serbia. Because of, let's say, the huge contribution of this energy supply for the country of Serbia, they had to start importing energy from abroad. And they had to do that for about 3 to 4 months, and that took huge amounts of money to replace, let's say, the shutdown of this energy supply. Well, this is a bit more upstream, so you go a bit more towards the east. There are several smaller villages being flooded, but also very big rural communities were flooded. You see them here, with you can of course imagine, let's say, that in terms of the impact on agricultural, that on crops, etc. It was the impact was very significant. Well, in this case, when we arrived, it was about, I think May. This was about May 19th or so. The water was already slowly receding, so it was a very quick kind of event. It took only a few days, and it was already receding. Here you see that they reinforced temporarily the levee along the Sava with all kinds of sandbags, and there was also a community more upstream that because of the sandbagging along the river, they did not flood. Well, this is another example of this sandbags and trying to prevent the water from flooding. And the good news for this area was that this sandbagged levee stood up well during the flood and did not cause any damage to the area behind. All right, I think you can stop here. So what caused this large flood event? Well, it was actually a very heavy rainfall event in this part of Europe that caused this flooding. Here you see the precipitation within a few days prior to the flooding, and you do see here that the precipitation was around 200-300 millimeters in certain places. In this area. What actually happened is there was a low pressure system that stalled for a few days above the Balkan region, and well, internationally it was called Ivet, but at Tamara in the Balkan region, this low pressure system dropped a lot of rainfall in this region, causing a very high river flow in the Sava river and its tributaries. In total for Serbia alone, about 60 people died, and most of them died in Obrenovac, which was very quickly flooded due to several breaches in the levee system. There were about 30,000 people evacuated in Serbia, and there were also a lot of people put in shelters. Actually, the interesting thing that we found out as UNDEC team is that a lot of people evacuated, but they were all, let's say, they evacuated to family, etc., etc. So they did not end up in, let's say, formal shelters, like shelters put up by the Red Cross or so, but they just went to family in other places of the country. Well, as I said, our assessment, so the UNDEC team basically focused on two things. The one was the coordination of international assistance. So there are a lot of countries in these kind of situations always offering all kinds of help, like very practical help with helicopters to rescue people, or like big pumps, high performance pump stations to drain water. Well, of course, what you don't want to see is that all that stuff is being transported to the country, but then stops. The transport stops at the airport. So one of the aspects of an UNDEC team is to make sure that all the stuff that enters the country at the airport is also being transported to the right place. And the other thing was that our assessment of the impact. Well, for that purpose, for assessing the impact, we made several trips, and that's being shown at this slide. So the red lines and also the lines are shown as the field trips that we carried out in, let's say, a week or two to do these kind of assessments. Quickly after the flooding, we came to the conclusion that there were actually two types of flooding taking place in Serbia. On the one hand, there was a very general low-lying areas like the city of Obrenovac that I showed you earlier. That was relatively gradually flooded, so that was along the river. But if you went up to, let's say, the more higher regions, then there was also a lot of flash flooding with the potential for landslides. And that happened, for instance, in Krupanj in Serbia, also with a lot of damage. Well, this was the city of Obrenovac that I showed you before. A lot of flooding. We also traveled around by boat to inspect the damage to houses and bridges. Well, it's of course then always very. It made a big impact, at least to me. Had to see, let's say, how such a city can be devastated by such a big flooding. Well, this is an idea of the flood depth. So you see, let's say, one of those houses in Obrenovac, and you also see it. But this is just, I think, a few days before the water was still, let's say, 2 to 3 meters, 3 meters high in this particular street. You also see that in this case the houses were flooded by basements, or the basements were being flooded. Well, this is an overview. This is a city a bit more upstream, Sabac. A lot of agricultural area around was flooded very significantly. This is also an interesting one. It is a big mine. So it was an open mine pit. That mine pit was completely filled with flood water. So, of course, the production of this mine was completely stopped. But the question was also, let's say, how do we drain this pit? And there was a German team working. The Germans have a so-called self-supplying pump capacity teams. And they drive with these trucks. They get into the country and they help with draining certain areas. And the question to me actually was, well, what should we do? Should we continue this? Well, made a quick calculation showing that if you would continue with this kind of pump equipment, then it would take around 3 years to get this mine drained, because the amount of water was huge in this particular open mine pit. So based on that decision, they stopped working at this site, and we moved them to other places where they could be more effective for the time that they had available. Actually, the final conclusion for this particular site was that they needed huge pumps to get this mine operating again. And the success story is that at the end, Van Hek, a Dutch contractor with very big pumps, was contracted to this mine to help draining this mine and get it operating again. And that was very good cooperation between, of course, Van Hek itself, a local contractor, but also the embassy, the local embassy in Serbia. They made it happen. So that's also how you see, let's say, that how we can help. Well, this is an example of that high capacity pumping. Well, it's a bit more than what the normal, what you see. Let's say if there is a typical problem in the Netherlands. But of course, you can imagine, let's say, that these kind of high performance capacity pumps are way not enough to drain such a big mine. Just to show you some of the impact on the agricultural side, was a big impact. Also the economy got a big hit in this area because of this flooding. And well, even let's say a week or two after the flooding, still certain areas were still underwater. And seeing the effects of this flood. This is an example of those so-called flash floods. So flash floods are floods that happen very quickly and often also coincide with landslides. This is a Krupanj, which is a bit more in a mountain region upstream in the Morava River basin. And also, yeah, you see especially the enormous devastation also to houses where it completely collapsed during this flood. Well, a complete destroy of houses as well. Another part of our assessment was to look at the impacts on roads, because there's another house being affected. But infrastructure is, of course, always also an important part of the assessment. Infrastructure is, of course, especially necessary once you want to start thinking about recovery again. Well, we made an overview, our assessment team made an overview of all the roads that were being closed, and where there was still risk of certain landslides. Another one, which you see here, is the risk of mine migration. That was especially also a risk mentioned during the flood. And you all remember, let's say, that this area was was in war during in the 1990s. A lot of landmines were still in the fields, and we had to be very careful when entering certain areas because of the potential of landmines still there. So that was also, and of course you can imagine, once there is a flood and let's say there starts erosion and those kind of things, that these can also be, let's say, displaced. So that was a very specific kind of risk during this flood. Well, there was a lot of also damage to infrastructure and to roads in this particular country. Complete bridges were collapsed, and the third aspect is the environmental aspect. During a flood, you can imagine, of course, that if there are, let's say, certain industries that have all kinds of chemicals at their sites, that can, of course, pose a risk to the water quality and also to the human well-being. So we did specifically assessments on also those industrial sites to see whether that could pose a problem to the water quality. Well, here you see two examples. So in the end, it turned out, let's say, that well, there were only limited risks from an environmental point of view, luckily enough. But it is a very important aspect to consider during a flood. Well, to conclude the findings, well, what we have seen during this flood is a very distinct kind of two different kind of impacts. Flash floods in the upper reaches of the river, and also the lowland flooding around, for instance, Obrenovac. That's also shown with this photo. Very significant damage to a lot of villages, infrastructure, etc. The good news was that the flood protection along the Sava River itself performed very well. But the key problem for this region is that it is mainly, let's say, the smaller tributaries towards the river Sava that were completely overwhelmed and were not, let's say, did not have sufficient capacity to get the water in a good way to the Sava River, and caused also the problem. Like, for instance, Obrenovac. Obrenovac is located along the Sava River. Well, the river itself and also the river levee itself stood up very well along the Sava, but actually the city was just completely flooded, let's say, through the back door by the overwhelming of the smaller water system. And that again, if you start thinking about solutions, then you get into the discussion, oh, who's responsible for what? And it turned out, let's say, that the water, for instance, the water system, that the Sava system, the Sava River, is the responsibility from the national government, whereas those smaller tributaries, that's the responsibility for the municipalities. But there is no systematic thought on, let's say, how to protect the area as a whole, and how to make sure, let's say, that this cannot happen. As I said, environmental impact was limited. We saw a lot of damage to roads and also due to landslides. And of course, this all needs, let's say, significant repair. And most of it, luckily, has now been done a year or so after the flood. But of course, it takes quite some investment, and the Serbian government partly had to lend this money from agencies like the World Bank to do these repairs. Well, what we did see as a team is that the rescue of people was done very well during this emergency. There was a lot of help also from the local Red Cross. So that whole system in terms of emergency response in Serbia worked very well, and there were no actual problems detected in that emergency response system. Our biggest recommendation to the Serbian government was that they need to try to put more emphasis on how can we prevent these kind of big disasters, because the economy, like you see here, as there was lost jobs and a decline in the economy purely as a result of this flood was just a decline in the economic growth of 0.5%, and that's a lot of money if you talk about these kind of economies. And that also, let's say, calls for action on prevention, not only on building maybe extra flood control infrastructure, but also doing more work on emergency early warning type of solutions. Well, that specific early warning type of solution that we recommended has been put forward. The World Bank has made a very quick kind of, well, they made a statement, let's say, that all the Balkan countries needed to work together to do this, to improve the early warning system for this Sava River basin. And currently, our firm is bidding together with Deltares, the National Institute. We are in a bid, so we are selected for a bid to prepare a new and improved early warning system for this region. Well, I think from a Dutch perspective, there is a lot of value that we can add. The trick is always how can we get that done? Well, the good news is, as I said, right now we are in such a bid, and I think that's the way to go. If there are these kind of projects at the market, what we try to do is, of course, to assist through those projects, these kind of countries, to help them and hopefully improve the early warning system. Well, this is just an example of these type of early warning systems. We build them up for certain countries and help them to improve the warnings for people. And another one is is flood protection, of course. Well, so far I haven't seen any kind of action to improve flood protection, but I hopefully that will also come for Serbia. And these are just two examples of projects that we have recently done, and hopefully these get also implemented in Serbia. Well, with this, hopefully you got a bit of an impression on my experience in the Serbia and the flooding. Hopefully it inspired you to work hard during your study, and I'm open for maybe a few questions. So thank you very much.
Are there any questions?
I was wondering, when you were there as a team, was your advisory capacity, was it very direct? Did you literally steer different emergency response teams, or were you more advising the government of how they should maybe use the resources that were given to them from other nations that assisted them?
Yeah, it's always a balance. The thing is that, of course, in such a situation, the primary responsible agency is the Ministry of Interior. So the National Ministry of Interior is in charge during these emergency response during these emergencies. And as an international team like the UN system, you always have to be very careful on, let's say, what you can or cannot say in these kind of situations. In our case, let's say, we very strongly advised to remove, for instance, the high-capacity pump stations, teams to other places because it didn't work for this particular site. In other situations, also, we redirected, let's say, certain international assistance that was called upon, and so that was very specific advice during the emergency. And apart from that, we also gave, let's say, a more long-term recommendation on, okay, what's next? What should you do after this flooding in terms of recovery? Yeah.
Thank you very much. We have some presents from the Watersnood.
Ah.
Thank you.
Dankjewel.
Yeah.